In the last clip, we dealt with the historical Jesus. But what we need to come to terms with is that even though the historical Jesus is hard to connect with, we still need to place Jesus within a context. And really, what would Jesus have been called in his own context? Well, generally, we would think that he would be Yeshua, bar Joseph. Yeshua bar Joseph. And that would be his Hebrew name. His Jewish name, well, at least his Jewish name. His Greek name would have been Jesus. And so Jesus, Yeshua, same name. Yeshua sounds a lot like Joshua. And so again, we've got Joshua as the name. Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus, all meaning God saves. That's the name that he would have been given. That's the name in which he comes into our world. That's the name that we connect with in terms of incarnation. And we'll talk a little bit about incarnation in the next module. But what we need to see in this particular module is that he comes into a context, and that is as a Jew. He doesn't come in as a Greek. He doesn't come in as a Syrian. He comes in a Jewish context, in a Jewish environment. And unless you understand that, unless you hold on to that firmly, you have no connection with what happens with the New Testament. Because the writers of the New Testament, as we've seen, are Jewish. They are writing, particularly at the early part of the first century, they are writing to a predominantly Jewish church. The balance between Jews and Gentiles only begins to tip in the beginning of the second century. So for the time when they're writing their Gospels, when they're writing their letters, they're writing particularly to a Jewish context. Jesus comes as a Jew. I find it ironic that in fact the church develops later on, during the Middle Ages, develops a theology called the Jesus killers. And of course referring to the Jews. And they say that it's the Jews who killed Jesus. As if somehow Jesus was one of them and not one of the Jews. I find it interesting, as the church develops, so what happens is that the Jewishness of Jesus begins to be removed from him. And what we begin to see is that the Jews become those other, becomes those enemy, rather than actually the source from which Judaism flows. In fact, what we find later on is that there's even a theology that develops called replacement theology, where in fact the Jews now are replaced by the Christians. They are removed by the Christians. And some of that is, of course, connected to the book of Hebrews, where Hebrews seems to be against his own people, against the Jews. He almost discounts the Judaism and Jewish tradition. However, I think that that's a misunderstanding of Hebrews, and certainly a misunderstanding of Christianity, where there's no question in my mind at all that the Judaism or the Jewishness of Jesus, the fact that he is Yeshua bar Joseph, is vitally important in interpretation. Without understanding the context of Jesus, without understanding the ground from which Christianity flows, I believe that Christianity is the weaker and the more brittle for it. And I believe that so often the reason why Christianity has had the theological arguments we've had is because we've not been able to connect and address Jesus as a person within a culture, within a custom, within a tradition. And therefore we need to understand the culture, tradition. We need to respect that culture and that tradition. We need to respect the environment in which Jesus appeared. Now, of course, many of you will say, but how do we even know it? We don't even know who wrote all the books of the New Testament. We don't even know when they were writing. And when they were writing is very significant, because if it's prior to 70 AD, then it's prior to the destruction of the temple. And if it's post 70 AD, well, then that's also important, because Jerusalem was destroyed. And therefore would change the way in which Judaism was functioning in that way. I agree. And that's why I believe that, yes, we will always have a hard time really being able to be sure of the understanding. But being sure or unsure is not the question. It's an acknowledgement and a respectfulness of the ground from which Jesus sprung, which helps us therefore to interpret the things that he was dealing with.